I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey lurkers, welcome to this week's episode. Before we get started, I wanted to just give a heads up that I did mark this episode as explicit because of the murder that I talk about. It's up to you if you want to skip it or not, or just be mindful if listening in the car with kiddos. I thought it was time to hit the trail again, and by trail I mean the haunted trail. For those of you who are newer and just joining us, The Haunted Trail is the name of a book that I'm working on that is a collection of paranormal stories from along the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. So far, we've covered Georgia in episode 57, North Carolina in episode 58, North Carolina and Tennessee in episode 66, and we just finished up Tennessee in episode 73. This week, we will start working our way through the state of Virginia. For a little background for anyone not familiar with the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, this is a trail that travels through 14 states: Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. The entire length of the trail is 2,194.3 miles, and that changes from time to time when obstacles need to be avoided or new property is obtained in order to avoid towns or roads. It is the longest hiking-only footpath in the world. People who hike the entire trail without breaks are called through hikers, and since they most commonly start in the south and head north, that's how we're working our way through it as well. The Appalachian National Scenic Trail is also called the Appalachian Trail, or simply the AT. Virginia, the state we're starting today, is home to the most miles of the trail, at around 550. As far as our stories here, there are some ghost stories, and there's also some true crime. It's a pretty interesting true crime story in my opinion, and one I wanted to cover on its own, but I figured we'll just cover it here. So let's get moving on the trail. The first town you come to in Virginia, headed north on the AT, is Damascus. Damascus, Virginia is a small town, also known as Trail Town, USA, because several renowned trails intersect within the town limits. It's also home to the Trail Days Festival that takes place there in May and features a hiker parade along with vendors and workshops geared towards hiking culture. It also features some ghosts. There is a ghostly woman seen in the area of Taylor's Valley and Green Cove near Damascus. Allegedly, the woman and her baby were killed. There are sightings of the woman searching for her child, and she gives off a creepy feeling. Her husband supposedly went AWOL from the Civil War, and she was sneaking him food. The woman and her baby were killed as a result. Now the woman's ghost is doomed to continue searching for her dead child. Another ghost in the area is that of Mrs. Creekfield. She lived in the mountains above Taylor's Valley, near the railroad tracks outside Damascus, with her husband, Mr. Creekfield. There was a rumor going around that Mr. Creekfield had murdered his wife and cut off her head. The only thing the locals knew was that Mrs. Creekfield wasn't seen around her house anymore. No one ever questioned Mr. Creekfield about where his wife was. People in the mountains tended to mind their own business and kept to themselves. One morning around 6 a.m., a man got up to feed the livestock on his farm and start milking the cows. As he was walking to the farm, He saw the figure of who he thought was Mrs. Creekfield walking down the railroad tracks, carrying a small, dimly lit lantern in one hand and her severed head in the other. Assuming his eyes were playing tricks on him, he just went about his business. The following week, during an early morning walk to the farm to cut hay, he saw the same woman out picking strawberries. This time, she carried her head in her bucket. He was a little bit more unnerved about the whole thing this time, and told the owner of the general store what he had seen. The general store owner revealed that he had also seen a lady behind his house, carrying what looked like her head under her arm. He hadn't told anybody because he was worried people would think he was crazy. There was another eyewitness account of the headless woman. One morning, as Robbie Thompson and I were making our usual inspection of the tracks, we saw something that I will never forget as long as I live. Our job was to make sure rocks or mudslides had not blocked the railroad tracks during the night. The fog was heavy as our car rounded the curve near Hanging Rock just south of Green Cove. Just ahead, I could faintly see somebody walking right down the middle of the tracks. I told Robbie to ring the bell as a warning that we were approaching. We were getting closer now, and I could see a figure of a woman wearing a long white dress. She didn't make any moves to get out of the way, so I pulled the brake lever as hard as I could. The wheels began to slide and squeak on the steel tracks. When we came to a stop, I could see her standing in front of us, with her arms stretched out as if she were holding back our motor car. This is when I noticed that Robbie had fainted, and that the woman had no head on her shoulders. As I looked down, I could see her other arm was wrapped around her bloody head. There was a faint smile on her face. The next instant, she seemed to have vanished out of sight. The hair on my head felt like it was standing straight up. After this, I'm sure that I set a new track record, excuse the pun, as I engaged the clutch on the motor car and pushed the throttle full forward. Poor Robbie was just coming to and looking like a ghost himself as we approached the rail sliding switch at the Taylor's Valley station. To this day, I still can't remember who operated the switch to allow our motor car onto the side track. The area where this headless ghost appeared is in the area of what is now called the Creeper Trail. Officially, it's called the Virginia Creeper National Recreation Trail, and it is about 34 miles long. It's one of the country's most prestigious rail trails, so called because it is a railroad track converted into a trail for bikes or hikers. It's not named for being creepy, but is instead named for the plant known as the Virginia creeper that grows in the area. I mean, it could be named Creeper Trail because it is creepy, apparently. There's a ghost woman that has been known to show up in photos taken along the Creeper Trail, though whether it's the headless ghost that we already mentioned or another trapped soul, I'm not sure. There's also allegedly a ghost train that has been seen traveling in the area where the tracks used to be. But honestly, in my research, I found this may be based on a fictional short story and not based in any actual fact. Once you're out of the town of Damascus, you come to the highest point in the state of Virginia, Mount Rogers. I came across a report of a Bigfoot sighting in an area near the foot of Mount Rogers. A woman said that she and her husband were sitting on their front porch one night when what she thought was a bear caught her attention along the tree line. She told her husband to look over at the bear, but her husband said it wasn't a bear because it was too large. They continued watching for about 2 minutes when a deer darted out from the tree line. The dark figure she thought was a bear stood up and chased the deer into the woods. She and her husband were in disbelief about what they had just seen. It was too far away to get any good detail of the animals, but was close enough to tell that it was very large and dark brown or black in color. After seeing it chase the deer on 2 legs back into the woods, she knew that no bear could have run so fast and so graceful on 2 legs. The next evening, her husband went to the spot in the tree line where they had seen the creature while the wife stayed on the porch so they could compare the size of the creature to her husband's height. Her husband was 5'10", and whatever they saw was at least 1.5 to 2 feet taller than he was. An investigator for the Bigfoot Field Researcher Organization, or BFRO, interviewed the woman for more details, and this is what she said. When I first saw the animal, it looked like a bear to me because it was crouched down beside a tree in the tree line, which made it look smaller in size, and also the fact that it was really dark in color. I nudged my husband, who was beside me on our porch, and told him to look at the bear. By the time I got his attention, the animal was still low to the ground, but had shifted its position. It looked larger than once spotted, but it was not in a full upright position as of yet. My husband David spends a lot of time outdoors, and has seen just about every animal that our area has in the wilderness, and he told me that it was not a bear, and for me to be quiet and watch. It stayed still for only a few moments until a deer jumped out of the tree line on the right side of the animal. When the deer was close to this unknown animal, it, the unknown animal, stood up on 2 legs and ran after the deer with astonishing speed. It chased the deer back into the woods, and that was the last we saw of it. This animal was so large, but yet it was very fast and moved with a graceful, fluid motion. It was so far away and happened so fast that I really didn't notice much more about it. And as of the arms, the only thing I could make out was that they looked longer than normal human arms, and that while it ran, it looked like the animal carried them more towards the backside of its body, instead of the side in which you would think they should be. It was a little over 100 yards from our position on the porch. This is why my husband wore his blaze orange gloves to make the comparison. It made it very easy to see the position of his hands instead of taking guesses. When he got to the same tree we first saw the animal at, he got as close to the tree as he could and started to raise his hands above his head. I told him to stop at the spot I thought was the closest to the top of the animal's head, and he said that it was at least 1.5 to 2 feet above his head. After the height comparison, he looked around for about 2 hours, trying to see if he can find any tracks or anything else that might leave a clue as to what it was. There was nothing. We asked all of our surrounding neighbors if they have seen anything unusual, and they all told us no. Some of them looked at us rather funny, but that was to be expected. We know what we saw, and we both know and feel deep down that we saw a Sasquatch that evening. Our family and friends either say we are crazy or are on the fence about believing in Sasquatch or not, but we know what we saw. A little further north, we come to the Grayson Highlands State Park. 2.8 miles of the Appalachian Trail runs through the park. One of the things that the Grayson Highlands is known for, or really what I personally know about it, is that it is home to a herd of ponies that were introduced there and allowed to roam wild within the park. Kind of like the ponies that are on Assateague Island in Maryland and Virginia, or the ponies that are down on the Outer Banks in North Carolina. Feeding or petting the ponies is not allowed, even though the ponies have no fear of humans. Also known to roam the park is another creature. Of course, I'm talking about Bigfoot. I don't recommend feeding or petting Bigfoot either. A local sheriff received a call from a man who claimed that he, his wife, and another woman and young boy saw a huge creature about 7 feet tall. The creature was hairy all over. It began walking near the road, and then when the light from the headlights of their car hit it, the creature ran back into the cover of the trees. There was another sighting on October 14th, 2011, in the afternoon. There were 11 people enjoying the first scenic overlook in the park. The person who reported the sighting, 8 of their family members vacationing with them, and 2 other park visitors. While they were enjoying the views, all 11 people observed a large, dark figure located approximately 200 yards below them, crouching down and focused intently on the ground. The primary witness believed the creature was either digging or pulling at an object, but he was not at all sure what it was doing. The thing was estimated to be over 7 feet tall, and the weight was approximated at 350 to 400 pounds. Its hair was black and about 2 to 3 inches long. The body was described as athletic, with broad shoulders, muscular body, and a torso shorter than a typical human. No female breasts were observed. The observer was most likely a man. The forearms were long compared to the body, and the upper arms were short. The wrists were thicker than a human's. The fingers were in a half curl. The head was small for the body and had a pointed cranium with a minimal neck. The face was wider than a person's and seemed to have a large jaw and a small nose. The animal seemed to sense their presence, and while the observers readied a camera, they watched the creature stand upright and walk 15 to 20 feet to a large tree. The thing observed them for some time from behind the tree, and did not seem to be afraid or in a hurry to leave. The entire thing lasted only about 5 minutes, before the figure went deeper into the woods and out of sight. There were photos taken, but they weren't clear. I'm sure that's pretty much a shock to everyone. The primary witness had extensive hunting and tracking experience and was certain that what he saw was not a bear or any other animal he was familiar with. We're going to leave the cryptids behind on the trail now and head north to a scarier story. Or at least it's one that I find far scarier. We're heading to the Wapiti shelter. Now, I've heard this said 2 different ways. I've heard Wapiti, and I've heard Wapiti. I don't know which one is correct. Just like Appalachian can be Appalachian or Appalachian. If you're further south, it's Appalachian. If you're further north, it's Appalachian. I'm going with Wapiti. I've explained in the other episodes that along the Appalachian Trail, there are structures along the way for hikers to stay in, referred to as shelters. Most of these are 3-sided buildings or lean-tos. Often there's a fire pit and picnic table. A privy and a water source is usually nearby. Some shelters are pretty rough, and others are nice, even sporting enclosed second floors. The Wapiti shelter is where the true crime story I mentioned in the beginning takes place. This true crime story, as I mentioned, is the reason I marked this episode as explicit. I know I have some tweens who like to listen to the podcast, so their parents can decide for themselves or skip this part in the episode. I realize not everybody is like me and enjoys not only scary ghost stories, creepy cryptids, but also is down for a really juicy true crime story. And then there's some people who are very much like me. Anyway, on April 1st, 1981, Robert Mountford Jr., 27, was through hiking the Appalachian Trail to raise money for a residential treatment center for disabled youth. He started his journey in the south, at Springer Mountain in Georgia, and was headed north to Mount Katahdin in Maine. In May 1981, Laura Susan, or Susu, Ramsey, joined him in Damascus, Virginia, and planned to spend a couple of weeks of vacation hiking with him until he reached Pearisburg, Virginia, where she planned to take the bus back home to Maine to celebrate her birthday with her parents. Susan and Bobby, as he was called, were both 27 and both worked as social workers at the Homestead, a residential treatment center for teens located in Maine. Both of them were considered experienced hikers, and both were described as large and muscular. On May 19th, the pair was seen at a country store near the trail getting some supplies before making their way to the shelter. That was the last time they were seen alive. The search for the 2 hikers started on Friday, May 29, 1981, when the parents and other hikers became concerned that they were 9 days overdue at their hiker hostel in Pearisburg, Virginia. Searchers began looking for them, aided by tracking dogs. On May 30th, 1981, around 7 p.m., Susan Ramsey's body was found, buried in a shallow grave, covered with dirt and leaves. She had a plastic garbage bag over her head and had been wrapped in a cotton sleeping bag liner about 75 yards from Wapiti shelter. The following day, on May 31st, Robert Mountford's body was found about 60 yards away from Susan. He was found with the help of a cadaver dog. Robert had been buried under dirt and rocks next to a big log. Robert Mountford was wrapped in his own sleeping bag. The bag Susan was wrapped in was not hers. The bodies were identified by a woman who had hiked with them and had become friends with them on the trail. Robert Mountford Jr. had been shot in the head and face 3 times with a .22 caliber pistol. Susan Ramsey had been bludgeoned with a piece of iron, then stabbed 13 times with a long nail, and also had stab wounds from a knife. She also had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she gave one hell of a fight. According to the medical examiner, Mountford and Ramsey were most likely killed around the same time and were dead several days before being found, most likely sometime right around the 19th of May. Police began their investigation and discovered a large blood stain on the floorboards of the shelter that had been covered over with charcoal smears from the fire. Police took the floorboards as evidence, and it was determined to be blood from Robert Mountford. There was a paperback book belonging to Susan found near Robert's body that had blood on it and a fingerprint that didn't belong to either of them. There was a paperback book belonging to Susan found near Robert's body that had blood on it and a fingerprint that didn't belong to either of them. It belonged to their suspect. Some of the personal belongings of Mountford and Ramsey were found, but their boots and packs never turned up. The suspect was 27-year-old Parisburg native named Randall Lee Smith, who lived with his mother. They searched the mother's house and found pornography and a pair of bloody shorts and a bloody shirt, neither of which belonged to Randall Smith. A search for Randall Smith ensued, and he was eventually arrested at a campsite in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, not far from where they found his abandoned truck. In the truck, they found a note that read, "This boy and girl have been so nice to me. It is going to be a real shame when the time comes to get rid of them." When he was arrested, Smith exhibited dissociative behavior, claiming to have forgotten everything about his past, but through psychiatric testing it was concluded that he was faking it. The state psychiatric team said Smith was neither feeble-minded nor mentally disorganized. On the day of Randall Lee Smith's trial, he unexpectedly accepted a plea bargain in which he would plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 30 years. But despite the 30-year sentence, which was ridiculous, based on the crime he had committed, he was released in 1996 after just 15 years into his sentence. He was released on mandatory parole with good behavior. This, of course, outraged the families of the victims, the law enforcement, and the hiking community, who protested his release. He ended up living with his mother and wore an electronic ankle monitor for 10 years for supervision. His monitoring was done in 2006. Then in 2008, Randall Lee Smith was reported missing. We're not done with him yet, by the way. On May 6, 2008, Sean Farmer was meeting up with his longtime friend Scott Johnston to go camping and fishing. Sean Farmer had been told there were some strange markings on some rocks up near where he and Scott planned to camp. Apparently, some hikers were spooked by it and opted to detour the area. But Sean and Scott had camped in the area at least 4 or 5 times before, and he wasn't concerned. Sean arrived at camp and found Scott's truck there and his tent already set up. While Sean set up his tent, a very gaunt man walked into camp and introduced himself as Ricky Williams, and said he ran into Scott down at the creek fishing, and Scott had invited him to dinner. So later, Sean and Scott cleaned fish, made some burgers, and ate with Ricky Williams and Ricky's dog. Both Ricky and the dog looked like they had been starving. Ricky eventually got up and walked behind Scott and Sean, called his dog to follow him. Then he shot Sean Farmer in the left side of his face with a .22 caliber pistol. Sean staggered but did not collapse. The man then pointed the gun at Scott Johnston, who went running for the trees. Johnston was shot in the neck, and then a couple of more times in the back. Ricky Williams then shot Sean Farmer in the chest at close range. Sean managed to get to a vehicle and started driving, picking up Scott on the way. They made their way down the curvy mountain roads and got help. Both men survived and were able to identify their attacker. I bet you know what I'm going to say, right? They identified their attacker as the man on the missing poster, Randall Lee Smith. Smith was found when he crashed the truck he was driving. He died a few days later from a blood clot because of his injuries. I'm still not done with this story. There was information found in 2008 after he shot the two men. Smith had caches all over the place, and police found one after the attack in 2008. In it were over 30 knives, 8 pairs of women's underwear, and several eyeglasses that looked like they were women's glasses. Also in the cache was a tape recording where screaming and moaning could be heard, and it was labeled as some kind of satanic ritual. There was also some handwritten material with incantations saying, "All hail guardians of the watchtower," which comes from the incantation to invoke spirits in the 1996 film The Craft, which is about witchcraft in case you don't know. One of the members in law enforcement who was involved in the investigation said that Smith was a sharp, cunning person and very precise in what he did. The possessions of the murdered hikers were buried and hidden in a complex pattern aligned with compass points. He also was very calculated, and that after he murdered the two hikers, he hiked south and removed the logbooks from shelters where Susan and Robert had written messages so he could throw off the police. In each shelter is a notebook or logbook for hikers to leave messages. It's a way to see if someone has stayed or stopped at a specific shelter and when. There was no motive given for the two murders. Smith said when asked, "I don't want to talk about it." Some people thought he might have been obsessed with Susan and killed Robert to be able to have her. The medical examiner said there was no evidence of a sexual assault because of the lack of seminal fluid, but I also read that the condition of the bodies made it hard to tell, and apparently sperm only lives 5 days. I really don't want somebody to go look at my search history on my computer. Another more accepted theory is that Randall felt he was protecting the area in some way. Randall was known to view hikers as interlopers and considered himself the keeper of the mountain. Anyway, this story is incredibly unnerving if you're a hiker. I often say I'm more afraid of the living than the dead, and this is why. Plus, there were almost 10 days in between the murders and the bodies being found, and hikers stayed in that shelter. They even mentioned seeing the strange charcoal smears on the floor. I also want to point out that some officers believe that the women's underwear and the glasses found in the cache in 2008 may indicate that there were other victims. They did search the area with cadaver dogs, but they never found anything. Sean Farmer also firmly believes that there have to be other victims of Randall Lee Smith. Now when people are hiking in the area, they mention having an uneasy feeling, especially around the Wapiti shelter. Just a few years ago, a couple of hikers mentioned a strange experience while they camped at Wapiti. When they had retired to their tents for the night, they heard footsteps, like someone was walking around stalking their camp. One of the hikers said there was a shadow of someone that he saw on his tent, and when he looked out, there was no one there. I'm pretty confident that it's probably Randall Lee Smith, looking for people camping in his territory. We're going to keep moving north to Pearisburg, Virginia. Have any of you seen Poltergeist? I'm sure some of you probably have. With the line, "Carol Ann, go into the light," whatever that little lady used to say. I really liked her. She was kind of creepy. I'm going to tell you about a poltergeist situation that occurred in Pearisburg in 1976. But it's nothing like the movie. I honestly have to say, I don't think I've ever watched that movie from beginning to end, ever. Maybe I should do that. The occurrence took place in the home of 65-year-old widow Beulah Wilson. Beulah was said to be a kind and caring Christian woman, and she had recently taken in a 9-year-old boy as a foster. The boy had been legally removed from the custody of his parents due to their problems with alcoholism. It was December, and the boy was looking forward to his first real Christmas. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to warn you that this might break your heart a little bit. I also want to point out that there were a lot of second and third hand accounts and a whole lot of rumors flying around about the events. So I managed to find a couple of news articles from that time that gave some first hand accounts from the people who actually witnessed it. On December 19th, 1976, around 8:30 p.m., things started. First, apples and oranges started falling from a table for no reason. Mrs. Wilson said, "I thought it was the cat that night have done it, because the cat was turning over things for years. Then everything started coming down all around us." The Christmas tree fell over into the boy. Mrs. Wilson picked it up, and it fell over again. Dishes fell and smashed. Wooden chairs and household items fell over. Table lamps and pictures crashed to the floor and slid to the center of each of 3 downstairs rooms. There was a 4th room downstairs that was untouched. It had a statue of Jesus at the head of the bed. At the direction of one of her sons, Beulah Wilson called the police, and she called her neighbor, who was a retired utility worker. Her neighbor, Martin Caldwell, came right over and was in time to see an old Singer sewing machine rise up and tip over. Trooper Pritchett, who was one of the responding officers, said, "At first I thought it was a domestic quarrel when I got the call. Now I just don't know. There's no way that boy could have the strength to do that himself. The boy and lady were completely calm when we got there." On December 20th, Mrs. Wilson's 40-year-old son Donald came to move his mother and her foster son into his house. While there, he witnessed a large cabinet get tipped over, with no one near it. A parapsychologist from the University of Virginia, Dr. J.G. Pratt, was called in to investigate. In the meantime, if Beulah and her family were hoping to get a reprieve from the activity by moving to Donald's house, they were mistaken. On 2 separate nights there was activity. On December 23rd, a table and a trophy toppled over for no reason. Then on December 24th, Christmas Eve, as the boy went upstairs, things began falling out of a hallway bookcase as if being thrown. Everyone could see that the boy was not doing it. But it stopped when the boy was outside the house. Because Donald's daughter was scared by this, and Donald himself feared for the safety of his family, that night, Christmas Eve, he took the boy to the sheriff's office. The boy spent the night there at the sheriff's office, and the next day, on Christmas, he was placed with another family. There were no other reports of activity. Martin Caldwell, the neighbor, said of the boy was as fine a kid as you could find. He and Beulah got along very well. He used to come over here all the time to ride a motorbike with my granddaughter." Dr. Pratt said after his investigation that the phenomena may have resulted from a peculiar manifestation of psychic energy along the lines of a poltergeist. This kind of situation generally involves a young person who is very unhappy and can't cope in a normal way. There is a release of psychic energy. It starts suddenly for no real reason and seems to stop just as suddenly. It's pretty heartbreaking thinking of that poor 9-year-old kid who just wanted to have a normal Christmas and instead got dropped off at the sheriff's office. That's going to do it for this episode. There are other stories from the Virginia section of the Haunted Appalachian Trail, so look for another Haunted Trail segment in the future. Until then, you can find Lurk wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or at lurkpodcast.com. On the website, you can find all of our episodes, plus links to our social media accounts. If you like what you hear, make sure you tell a friend, and if you have a moment, please consider giving us a 5-star review. And until next time, keep lurking.